The metal blade of a knife glinted in the crowd as a tall man in a black hood abruptly grabbed the student, pinning her against a wall near the main entrance of the New York Museum of Modern Art. "I'm counting to 3. His voice was loud, hoarse, full of desperation and rage. Hundreds of tourists froze, not daring to move. However, the only person who did not seem to be affected by the incident was a museum security guard standing a few meters away in an impeccably pressed suit. His gaze, cold and fixed, resembled steel rather than the eyes of a living person. The attacker was squeezing the knife harder, the tip already leaving a thin line on the frightened girl's neck. The tourists froze in horror, not noticing how the guard's comm surface was beginning to show the action that had been practiced over years of special operations and combat missions in hot spots around the world. He took an almost imperceptible step forward, carefully calculating every detail. In a moment, chaos would reign around him, but this man, trained to overcome fear and danger, knew exactly what he had to do. An autumn evening was falling heavily in Manhattan when a man in his 40s, wearing a worn baseball cap, appeared on the sidewalk at the entrance to the New York Museum of Modern Art. Brandon Grayson was an unemployed veteran, a former Marine sergeant who had long since lost himself to alcohol and bookmaker losses. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his accumulated dissatisfaction with life, and his eyes burned with a desire to make himself known for once so that the whole world would notice. Tourists crowded around the entrance, absorbed in taking pictures of the famous facade and installations. Teenagers were taking selfies, young couples were hugging in front of the cameras, and elderly couples were carefully examining the poster of the avant-garde art exhibition. All of this caused Brandon to feel only bitter contempt. He saw only the empty entertainment of rich people who had never experienced real pain. Brandon's gaze settled on the museum guard standing near the entrance. Tall, sturdy, perfectly ironed suit, calm expression on his face, professional poise in every movement. This image, impeccable and unwavering, stood in stark contrast to Brandon, whose insecurity was masked by aggression. The thought occurred to him. If he couldn't win respect, he would make her afraid. Determination filled his every move. Brandon abruptly took the glass bottle half full of lemonade from the young tourist and smashed it with all his might against the stone curb. The shards glittered under the evening lights, attracting the attention of the crowd. "Now you will all see the true price of your safety," he croaked, holding the sharp edges of the bottle forward. Now he was the center of attention just as he had always dreamed. The guard remained motionless, but his eyes instantly came to life, carefully assessing the situation. Only the most experienced observer could have noticed the change in his body tension, the muscles under his uniform filled with energy, ready to explode at any moment. Brandon stepped closer, brandishing the broken bottle. His voice shook with adrenaline and nervous excitement. "I'm going to count to 3. And if you don't move, it'll show you what kind of hero you really are." The tourists around froze. The air seemed to be frozen. The tension became unbearable. Brandon felt his heart pounding in his chest and started counting. 1. He took a deep breath, trying to gain confidence in his actions. But the thought of defeat was already creeping into his mind. 2. The crowd froze. Tourists were afraid to even blink. The guard's gaze remained impenetrable, calm, but you could already see his muscles tense, his posture slightly change, preparing for the only decisive movement that would divide his life into before and after. Brandon swung, preparing to say the last digit. But it was at this moment that something happened that none of the audience could have even predicted. The third word never came out. Instead, the muffled sound of a siren suddenly came on, distracting Brandon for a split second. It was this brief moment of inattention that proved fatal. The guard, who had looked like a motionless statue until then, exploded into motion with the precision that could only be expected from a professional special forces fighter. In one swift movement, he dodged the bottle, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and twisted his arm with lightning speed so that the bottle fell helplessly to the asphalt and shattered. The crowd exhaled a collective sigh, but no one dared to approach. Brandon groaned in pain as he fell to one knee, but his eyes flashed with even more fury. "Do you think this is the end?" he shouted, releasing his other hand, which held a small but sharp pocket knife. The guard remained silent, his eyes focused only on the knife. He instantly assessed the situation. No panic, no unnecessary movements. Just a clear analysis. The location of the attacker, the proximity of the crowd, the risk to people nearby. Brandon swung the knife sharply, trying to stab the guard. But the guard already knew what to do. A sharp step to the side, a dodge, a palm strike on the attacker's wrist. The knife flew out of his hand and clattered to the concrete. One more precise move, and Brandon's arm is already locked behind his back, and he is pressed face first against the cold wall of the museum. The first police sirens were already approaching, breaking through the noise of Manhattan, but Brandon was struggling desperately, spitting curses. "You think you're a hero?" he shouted, trying to break free of his grip. "You're all just dolls for tourists. Empty people in expensive suits." The guard answered for the first time in a long time, his voice sounding quiet, but every word was metal. "True power is not in threatening others. True strength lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves." There was absolute confidence in these words, backed by years of real combat experience. Brandon fell silent, suddenly realizing that he was not an ordinary bodyguard, but a man who had seen death not only in movies or on the streets of Manhattan, but in real wars and real battles. At that moment, the sirens of police cars could be heard all around. The guard felt Brandon's body stop resisting. Instead of rage, his eyes were filled with emptiness and fear. The crowd finally began to come to their senses, some applauding, some filming, and some simply unable to believe what had happened right before their eyes. However, the security guard realized that although he had stopped the threat today, it was only the first drop of something much more serious coming. He felt that the story with Brandon was just the beginning of something bigger that hadn't ended that night. These were the thoughts that haunted him as the police handcuffed his attacker's hands. And the night was just beginning. The next morning, the video of the incident went viral, spreading through social media not only in New York City, but also far beyond. The museum's security guard, Jake Campbell, whose name was now known by millions, tried to ignore the hundreds of calls and messages. For others, he became a hero, but for him, it was a reminder of a past he wanted to forget. A past he had kept silent about. Afghanistan, covert operations in Syria, dozens of missions that left scars on his body and soul. He left the army to forget this horror, but now his past has caught up with him right in the middle of Manhattan. The next morning after the incident, a strange woman was waiting for Jake in his office, confident, calm, but he could see the tension in her eyes. It was FBI agent Sarah Welch, who worked in the counterterrorism division. "We need to talk," she said without further ado. "The man you took down, Brandon Grayson, is no ordinary criminal. He's a member of an extremist group that's planning something more serious than an attack outside a museum." Jake looked at her intently, feeling the familiar world turn into a battlefield again. "What exactly are they planning?" he asked calmly, but everything was already boiling inside. The attack was a provocation. They wanted to attract attention, to create media hype. And the real attack will happen soon. "And, Jake," she paused, "it looks like they know more about you than you think." Campbell felt his body instantly tense. It meant only one thing: someone from his past had decided to get even with him personally. "What do you mean?" His voice remained even, but a spark of determination had already flashed in his eyes. The woman handed him a folder of documents. "They know who you are. They know where you live, where you work. They even know about your sister. They clearly plan to use you. That's why I'm here." Jake quickly looked through the materials. There were photos, addresses, phone numbers, details of his previous missions. They knew more about him than most of his friends. "You're the only one who can predict their next move," the woman continued. "We want you to help us." Jake was silent, looking out the window. People ran past the glass, unaware that somewhere among them was the danger he knew so well. But inside, he had already made a decision. It was time to return to the life he had hoped to leave behind. "What exactly do you know?" he finally said, turning back into the soldier he had always been at heart. "All we have," she replied, "is that they are planning something big for Thanksgiving. We only have 3 days to stop them." Jake nodded, realizing he had no choice. It was time to return to the war he thought was over. Only this time, the stakes were much higher, and he knew there was no turning back. 2 days before the big Thanksgiving Day parade in Manhattan, Jake had no doubt that the extremists were preparing an attack for that very day, when millions of tourists would be flooding the city's streets. The information he gathered with the help of Sarah, the FBI agent who recruited him, confirmed his worst fears. The attack was planned in the heart of the city, in Times Square, during a large-scale holiday parade. However, Jake was worried about something else. Why did the group decide to bring him into their game? Why was he the center of attention for the criminals? The answer came unexpectedly and painfully. A few hours before the parade, in an empty underground parking garage near the museum where he worked, Jake met the person he least expected to see, his former special operations partner, Mike Wheeler, an officer presumed dead after a botched raid in Syria. "Hello, Jake," Mike spoke calmly, but his eyes burned with cold hatred. "You're probably surprised to see me alive, aren't you?" Jake froze, carefully studying his old friend, looking for signs of danger. "Mike, what does this mean?" "It means justice, Jake," he said coldly. "You left me there to die. I was left for dead and forgotten. But I survived. I came back to make this world pay." "That's insane," Jake replied, holding back his rage. "You're going to blow up innocent people to get back at me?" Mike smiled a cold smile. "No, Jake, so that you can understand what loss is. Do you know what it's like to have your loved ones die right in front of you?" Suddenly, a weapon flashed in Mike's hand. But Jake, who had returned to fighting form in recent days, was ready for anything. He reacted quickly, throwing his opponent to the ground. The fight began, brutal, silent, with precise, short blows that caused not just physical pain, but brought back old grievances and memories. After a short but fierce struggle, Jake managed to pin Mike down, pinning him to the concrete floor. There was no hatred left in Mike's eyes, only deep disappointment. "You've missed the point, Jake," he whispered, breathing heavily. "This is just the beginning. The explosives are already in place. You'll never stop it in time." Jake didn't listen any further. He was already running up the stairs, darting out into the crowded plaza where thousands were celebrating Thanksgiving. The timer in his head was ruthlessly counting down the seconds to disaster. He had only one chance. Among the crowd, he spotted a hooded man looking around nervously, too nervous for a normal tourist. Jake realized it was him. The last chance to save hundreds of people was in front of him. He rushed forward, risking his own life. In a moment, the man was already lying on the asphalt, and the detonator fell out of his hands and disappeared into the crowd. People parted to watch Jake holding the attacker. This moment of silence was broken by the sound of sirens approaching the square. The explosives had failed to detonate. Jake, covered in bruises and blood, felt incredibly relieved. Sarah came up to him, saying quietly, "You saved hundreds of people, Jake. They will never forget that." "I don't care about the fame," he replied, catching his breath, "as long as the past no longer has power over me." When the police took the attacker away, Jake was left in the middle of Times Square. Tourists, who had only now realized the gravity of the situation, began to applaud, seeing him as a hero who had saved the city from a terrible tragedy. But for Jake, that day was a victory over himself. He was not looking for glory. He found something much more important: liberation from the demons of the past, the feeling that for the first time in many years he was alive again.